Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the 18th Annual Town History Series at the Patent Free Library. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I am the brand new Archivist and Special Collections Librarian in the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at the Patent Free Library. Many of you know Reference Librarian Jack Martin, who has graciously agreed to play tech support today. Thank you, Jack, for all of your incredible work on this year's series. This 18th Annual Town History Series is dedicated in memory of Joseph Charles Sy, who passed away in July of 2021. Joe was a History Room volunteer for over 22 years, and during that time, he was instrumental in creating and maintaining the memory database, which indexes obituaries in our newspapers. If you've ever come into the room and had the librarian find an obituary for you in just a matter of moments, you have Joe to thank for that. This is a Zoom webinar, so you will notice that you cannot unmute or turn on your camera, but you can use the chat and Q&A feature. So please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A at any point during the talk, and at the end of the presentation, we will facilitate that Q&A with our speaker. If you need to communicate with Jack or myself about any technical issues, you can use the chat feature. If we don't answer all of your questions today, you are welcome to email us at history@patent.lib.me.us, and we can forward them on to our speaker. Today is the last presentation of this year's series, and it's sponsored by the West Bath Historical Society. We thank them for their generous support of today's talk. I also want to thank all of the historical societies of our 5 member towns for selecting such wonderful speakers this year and for helping to get the word out. Thank you also to Peter Goodwin and Robin Haynes, former managers of the History Room and founders of the Town History Series. And then finally, thank you to you, our audience. Thank you for building such incredible momentum and excitement for this series year after year, and for showing up today on Zoom. The West Bath Historical Society would like to dedicate today's talk to Sally Graves, who passed in October 2021. Sally was a dedicated board member of the West Bath Historical Society Board of Trustees for many years and was a Town History Series presenter. We thank Sally for her many years of service to the community. Our speaker today represents the West Bath Historical Society. Jim Brophy is a professor emeritus of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is a new resident to West Bath and a board member of the West Bath Historical Society. Jim will be presenting a very different kind of history today than we usually talk about. Welcome, Jim. Take it away.
Thank you, Mary Kate. My name's Jim Brophy, and my wife and I moved here to West Bath about 14 months ago, after having spent over 35 years in Bloomington, Indiana, where we raised 2 wonderful daughters. It was a wonderful life. But we both have New England roots, and when we retired, we decided that we wanted to come back to this part of the country. As a geologist at Indiana University, my specialty was what we call hard rock, which is what coastal Maine is all about. And so since arriving here, I've been like a kid in a candy shop. So with that, I guess I'd like to start my presentation. So I'm going to hit share screen. Got it. I'm still working on this. There we go. Okay, where to start? Geology of West Bath and its influences on the early years. This talk was supposed to be given back in January, but was postponed because of weather. As a newcomer to West Bath, I really want to learn as much as I can about my new home. And as a geologist, I've come to realize that much of what makes West Bath special, not necessarily unique, but special, is the local geology and geologic history of the region. So with this presentation, I hope to, 1, give you an appreciation for the local geology of West Bath, 2, an understanding of how this geology sort of came to be, and then finally, 3, how the local geology has played a role in many important aspects of West Bath's history. The geology of West Bath and all of mid-coast Maine actually is intimately connected with the theory of plate tectonics. And this is a unifying theory of how the Earth works geologically. If you're going to understand West Bath's history geologically, we need to know the basics of plate tectonics. So this is the very, very basic part. In short, the outermost layer of the Earth is made up of several rigid plates that are in constant motion relative to one another. Some plates are spreading apart from other one, so other plates are colliding with one another. On the surface of the Earth, there are 7 major plates and several minor plates. The plates consist of oceanic crust or thicker continental crust. Plates are created at something called spreading center or mid-ocean ridge, and plates are consumed at something called a subduction zone. Now, there are 2 different types of subduction zones. One where oceanic crust is being subducted beneath continental crust. The other would be where oceanic crust is being subducted beneath oceanic crust. When 2 continents collide, which is going to happen at this oceanic continental subduction zone eventually as this continent moves here, this is when huge mountain ranges, like the Himalayas, are formed. And that's about all you really need to know at this point. So let's turn to West Bath. This is a geologic map of the West Bath area and superimposed on a Google Earth image. And how does one read a map like this? Well, the different colors are keyed to different types of rocks. So in this particular case, the most abundant rock, which underlies the entire region, shown in sort of a pale blue, is something that we're going to refer to as metamorphic rock. Literally embedded within this metamorphic rock are these sort of parallel, semi-parallel, north-trending stringers shown in orange, and this rock is granite. And then finally, embedded in the metamorphic rock throughout West Bath are these small bodies shown in solid red. These are something called pegmatite. So I'd like to look at these individually. Let's start with metamorphic rocks. These are usually associated with continental collision and mountain building. They start out life as sediments, mud, silt, sand, which have accumulated along the margins of continents. If these continents collide with one another via subduction, then after collision, these sediments can find themselves buried deeply, several miles deep, within the roots of the developing mountain belt. At these great depths, they experience very high temperature and pressure, and they undergo a process of recrystallization. In essence, they metamorphose. In the process, new minerals are formed, typically muscovite and sometimes garnet. And when muscovite is a prominent mineral, because it itself is a platey-like looking mineral, metamorphic rocks oftentimes take on a layered appearance to them. So what do metamorphic rocks look like in the field? First off, this is a road cut on Mountain Road, and they're very dense, but most importantly, they are very layered. This is a hallmark of metamorphic rocks. And if one was to look carefully, one could see alternating layers of dark and light minerals. They are often intensely deformed or folded. This is another road cut, a little bit south from the previous one on Mountain Road. And if one looks carefully, they can see that these layers have been intimately folded or deformed. It may be tough to see, so I've tried to highlight this deformation and folding in the diagram below. This is an indication that at the very high temperatures that these metamorphic rocks were forming, they literally flowed like putty. So on to granite. Granite forms from molten rock, magma that's injected into older more often than not metamorphic surrounding rock. And the granite starts to crystallize from the margins inwards, continues to crystallize until eventually it has formed a uniform body of solid granite. What does granite look like? Well, like metamorphic rocks, it's very dense. This is a road cut on State Road at the top of Witch Spring Hill. But unlike metamorphic rocks, it is not layered, nor is it folded. And if one was to take a very close-up look at what a granite looks like, excuse me, they would see that it's made up of pretty fine-grained minerals, all of them essentially the same grain size, and it's a mixture of light and dark minerals. This is granite. On to pegmatite. Pegmatites are derived from crystallizing granite. All granite magmas contain small amounts of dissolved water in them. As the granite crystallizes, the water gets concentrated in the remaining liquid magma. Eventually, the water concentration gets so high that water, or really steam, literally starts forming bubbles in the magma. And these bubbles can start coalescing to form discrete bodies of steam, which can then stream outwards into the surrounding rock along fractures and fissures. The escaping water, or steam, contains a lot of dissolved material from the original magma. And as it escapes, it cools and crystallizes to form the very same minerals as one finds in the host granite. The difference is that because these crystals are crystallizing from steam rather than a viscous hot magma, they have a tendency to form very large crystals, very large crystals. And this is what distinguishes them from granite. Linear, or actually tabular bodies in the third dimension that have clearly been injected into, in this particular case, older metamorphic rock. They are typically bright white in color, which is a reflection of the minerals that are in them. And as mentioned before, they contain very large crystals. If you look at the geology pick for scale here, this is a single crystal of a mineral called feldspar. Incidentally, these pegmatites are at Reed State Park, which there are just some incredible examples of pegmatite. The other place is Pemaquid Point, if you want to see some really, really good examples of pegmatite. It's important to note that main pegmatites, and pegmatites in general, can be an important source of gem minerals, like beryl, which is the source for emerald, and the green tourmaline, which Maine is so famous for. Pegmatites are also important for strategic minerals like feldspar, and as we'll see later on, a mineral called muscovite. One last thing is what happens to the metamorphic rocks and granite bodies below the ground surface. Well, recall that the metamorphic rocks are layered, and this layering dips generally in an eastward fashion. And the granite bodies, which on the surface look like linear bodies, are actually tabular. And they too dip at about 45 degrees to the east. So much for the geology of West Bath. It's simple, but it's complicated. The next important question is, how did it all get here? For this, we have to go way back in time. So let's start about 460 million years ago. The world was a very different place at this time. This is a schematic diagram of the southern hemisphere of the Earth. And 460 million years ago, there would have been multiple continents, which to us would be unrecognizable. And these continents are constantly moving around on the surface of the Earth via tectonics, plate tectonics. And eventually, some of them are just bound to collide. The two continents of interest for Maine are a large continent, which geologists have referred to as Laurentia, and a smaller continent, Avalon. Now, in this and future diagrams, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my mouse here. Keeps going in and out. But in this and future diagrams, there's going to be a red star. And this will indicate the rocks, which eventually are going to become the coastal rocks of Maine. So the continents of Laurentia and Avalon are approaching one another via an oceanic continental subduction zone. Along the margins of both of these continents, Laurentia and Avalon, were thick accumulations of sediment, sand, silt, mud, whatever. These sediments are the future rocks of Maine. So let's fast forward about 60 million years. We now find ourselves 400 million years ago. Laurentia and Avalon have collided with one another. And in so doing, they have formed a huge mountain range, which geologists feel was much, much larger than the Himalaya range is today. So this is what Maine would have looked like from the air about 400 million years ago. But what about those sediments? Those sediments have been buried, heated up, squeezed, squoze, twisted, folded, recrystallized. You may name it, it's happened to them. They are now metamorphic rocks, but buried almost 10 miles deep in the roots of this mountain range. But something else happens as well. The deepest and hottest parts of the now metamorphic rocks get so hot that they start to melt. And when they melt, they start forming granite magma, which then can migrate up into the overlying metamorphic rocks to create bodies of semi-parallel bodies of tabular bodies of granite. And as these granites crystallize, they produce small-scale pegmatites. So the rocks of West Bath are now complete. We have layered metamorphic rock, semi-parallel bodies of granite, and small pegmatites. But they're still buried 10 miles deep beneath the surface of the Earth. Let's fast forward another 40 million years. Now we find ourselves 360 million years ago. During this time interval, all of the continents on the surface of the Earth have collided with one another to form a single huge continent, which geologists refer to as Pangaea. Note that the future rocks of Maine are in the middle of this large continent, about 10 miles deep. With one very important exception, this pretty much represents the end of the geological activity in this area. For the next 360 million years, the only geologic process has been erosion. But there's one exception, and a huge exception it was. About 250 million years ago, large fractures started to develop in Pangaea. And these fractures outline fragments of continent, which eventually would become the continents that we recognize today. Note that the rocks of coastal Maine, once these continents started spreading apart from one another, now find themselves on the margin of the continental landmass again. And this process has been going on until it brings us to the present day, where we see the familiar continents that we know of. It's important to recognize, however, that what we see today is just a snapshot in time of an ongoing process. If we were to come back 50 million years from now, the world would be quite different than it is today. The last geological event of consequence for Maine was the Ice Age. And it started around 2.6 million years ago and ended only around 12,000 years ago, which geologically is a blink of an eye. During this time, Maine was intermittently covered by glacial ice that reached miles in thickness. As little as 15,000 years ago, this is what Maine would have looked like. What were the consequences for West Bath? Significant. Recall the geology of West Bath. Semi-parallel bodies of granite embedded within metamorphic rock. As the glacial ice moved over this area, all of these rocks are going to be eroded. But the amount of erosion that takes place is going to be controlled by the hardness of the rocks. And granite is much harder than metamorphic rock. And undoubtedly, there are going to be some horizons of metamorphic rocks which are harder and more resistant to erosion than softer metamorphic rock. So what happens? This sets the stage for something called differential erosion. Consider somewhere in West Bath, very schematically, where we have north trending granites surrounded by, for example, less resistant metamorphic rocks and perhaps a layer of more resistant metamorphic rock. All of these are trending in a generally northern direction. The soft metamorphic rock is softer than the more resistant metamorphic rock, which is softer than granite. As the glaciers advance, all of these rocks are going to be eroded. But the softer metamorphic rock, shown in pale blue, are going to erode faster than the hard metamorphic rock, shown in pink, which is going to erode faster than the granite, shown in orange. After the glaciers melt and retreat, what's left? Well, basically, north-south trending ridges, which are made up by the resistant granite and more resistant metamorphic rock, with intervening valleys underlain by the softer metamorphic rock. Is this what one sees in West Bath? Absolutely. This is an oblique Google Earth image of central West Bath. Here's the New Meadows River, just to orient yourself. And what we see here in Mill Cove and Back Cove is numerous ridges, valleys, ridges, valleys, ridges, valleys. This is exactly what one sees. So a final question, though, is how can rocks that were once buried nearly 10 miles deep now be exposed at the surface of the Earth? The answer is a little bit counterintuitive, but it's erosion. Recall that these low-density continental crust is literally floating on much higher density rocks that we call the mantle, much like cork floats in water. Cork is actually a pretty good analogy, so let's use it. Imagine a cork floating in water. I've highlighted the base of the cork by red. And take a knife or an X-Acto knife or something and slice off the upper part of that cork, i.e. you've eroded some of it. What's going to happen? Well, we all know that the cork is going to bob up a little bit. Let's slice it again. The cork is going to bob up. Slice again. The cork is going to bob up. Until eventually what was at the bottom of the cork, deep in the water, is now at the surface of the water. This is exactly what happens to large mountain ranges over hundreds of millions of years. And this is exactly what happened to Maine and West Bath. Now that we know something about the geology and geologic history of West Bath, let's switch gears and see how it influenced various industries, I'll call them, that have characterized West Bath over the years. Let's start with Greater Bath, which is now West Bath and Bath, in the mid-1700s. At this time, the region was pretty much devoid of settlers, and this was a result of ongoing Indian wars dating back to the 1600s, which pretty much drove away the original settlers. According to Owen, the period from 1724 to 1738 was a period of rebuilding, of the filtering in of new settlers, and the return of some of those who had been driven away, and in general, the setting of the stage for future growth. So let's look at Bath at the end of this period in 1738. This is an extract from a map made by Jonathan North in 1751 and reproduced in Owen, 1936. At this time, Bath was very sparsely settled. Only 6 families lived in Bath or maintained farms, and most of them were along the western bank of the Kennebec River, the stretch that is now called Long Reach. If you were to come back 14 years later, 1752, we would see that there's been explosive growth. What was 6 families was now 18. People are not only living along the Kennebec, they're now living along the New Meadows. What facilitated this increase in settlement? My suspicion is that it was the introduction of the tidal mill industry to the area. As Purrington, 1976, said, in order for a settlement to be successful, it was essential to have 1 or more mills built and put into operation for sawing the trees into lumber, as well as grinding the corn into corn meal. Turns out that West Bath was ideally suited for the construction of tidal mills. Why is that? We'll get to that. But first, what is a tide mill? It's ingenious technology, which dates back to Roman times and possibly much earlier. In short, a dam is built across a body of water that's tidal. In the dam is an opening with large hinged wooden sluice gates. And on the incoming tide, the incoming tidal current keeps these sluice gates open, and the area behind the gate fills up with water. But as the tide turns, the outgoing tidal current automatically closes these sluice gates, holding all the water back behind. Approximately 1 hour after high tide, the water behind this dam is directed down an intake channel, which strikes a horizontal turbine wheel, which drives a vertical shaft, which is either directly connected to millstones or, not shown here, could, through a series of gears, be converted to horizontal motion for running a sawmill. It's important to note that all of the early tidal mills in West Bath were sawmills. I'm sure getting the lumber was more important than grinding the corn, which could have been done by hand. Grist mills came later. So what made West Bath ideal for tidal mills? According to the Tide Mill Institute, the 3 ingredients for a successful tidal mill are: 1, a large average tidal range; 2, an enclosed body of water with a reasonably narrow inlet; and 3, solid bedrock or ledge on both sides of the inlet to provide foundations for a dam. So let's look at these. Average tidal ranges. This is a map of the Gulf of Maine showing the average tidal ranges in feet at specific locations within the Gulf. One can quickly see that the average tides within the Gulf are much higher than the average tides outside of the Gulf. Why is this? It's because as the tide comes in, the incoming water slows down and literally piles up as it hits the flat, shallow bottom of the Gulf. Now, West Bath has an average tidal range of around 9.5 feet, which is very significant. So ingredient 1, average tidal range, check. Numerous enclosed water bodies with narrow inlets. Well, this is a Google Earth image of central West Bath. Here's the New Meadows River, or just to locate yourself. And there are numerous enclosed water bodies with narrow inlets. There's Mill Cove. There's Back Cove. There's Dam or Sears Cove. And then finally, there's Winnegant's Creek. So ingredient number 2, check. rocky shorelines on either side of the inlet. This is mid-coast Maine, so need I say more? So ingredient number 3, check. So the conclusion is that the geology and geologic history of West Bath provided the ideal setting for the development of tidal mills. So let's look at some of West Bath's tidal mills. The first mill was constructed in 1740 by Joseph Barry and a partner known as Mr. Sears. Continued to operate until 1869, which is almost 130 years. Not bad. In 1739, Barry purchased the tract of land shown here. The west boundary is not exactly clear, so I didn't try and include it. But included in this property was a large enclosed bay with a very, very narrow outlet. I have no doubt that when Barry purchased this piece of property, that he had the intention of building a tidal mill and setting up a business. So he constructed a dam across the narrow inlet, built a mill house on the southern end of the dam. Note that he didn't build his dam at the narrowest part of the inlet, which my suspicion is that he always had the intention of adding more mills to his already existing dam, which he did later on. So the longer the dam, the more opportunity for growth. These are some pictures of what's left of Barry's mill. These two are from 1938. This is looking south along Barry's Mill Road. Note that what today is the causeway was a bridge at that time. And this is a view looking southwards from the bridge. One can see the remnants of his dam and the remnants of the mill. This is all that's left today. It's the Google Earth image, just a small remnant of the dam, which one can see as they drive over the causeway on their way into town. As the population of Bath grew, so did the need for more mills. Sears, Mr. Sears, Barry's partner, sometime in the late 40s, decided to set up shop on his own and built a tidal mill on what is now known as Dam Cove. In the late 1700s, Philip Higgins, who lived in Foster's Point area, owned land where he set up his own small tidal mill. And then finally, there's the granddaddy of them all, the Morse Mills in 1801 in Winnegans. Recall that at this time, Winnegans was a tidal creek that had not been closed off by the causeway here. And in 1801, Morse built a 400-yard long dam, the original pilings of which can still be seen here at low tide. And on this dam, he placed 8 individual sawmills. Just an incredible engineering feat. Now, it's important to note that in 1801, Winnegans was part of West Bath, so we can claim the bragging rights for this one. As tidal power gave way to steam power, the tidal mill industry was supplanted by a new industry, and I will call it the rest and recreation industry. It started in the late 1800s and peaked in the early 1900s. Starting in the late 1800s, multiple southern colonies developed in West Bath. Each one of these colonies would have consisted of multiple rustic, non-insulated cabins that were occupied only during the summer. These colonies would have been Rosedale, located near the current location of West Bath Town Hall, Foster's Point, Quaker Point on Mill Cove, Sabino at the very southern end of Mill Cove, Birch Point at the southern end of West Bath, and Brigham's Cove. Originally, these summer colonies and cottages, I think were built by well-to-do people from Bath. But eventually, people from Portland, Boston, New York, and even further away started coming to West Bath for the rest and recreation that it could provide. At the same time, to accommodate all the people that were starting to come to West Bath, many upscale inns abound, often associated with individual colonies. So, for example, there was New Meadows Inn and the Grandview Inn, both on the New Meadows River. There was Foster's Point House in Foster's Point, the Birchwood Hotel in Birch Point, the Quaker Point Inn in Quaker Point, and then finally the Idle Park Restaurant down in Brigham's Cove. These attracted people from all over New England. What was so attractive about West Bath and the New Meadows River? I think it was the multiple bays and inlets that provided a real sense of privacy, relatively calm waters that were excellent for fishing, sailing, swimming, and easy access via steamship or train from Portland, which in turn was an increasing contact with the rest of New England. But what is responsible for the multiple bays and inlets? The very same parallel ridges and valleys, which in turn are a consequence of the geology and geologic history of the region. What is responsible for the calm waters? The New Meadows River is not a river. It's an estuary, which is a narrow inland extension of the ocean. Unlike the Kennebec, the only currents are tidal. Final industry that I wish to discuss is the granite quarrying industry. In the mid-1800s, granite quarrying was becoming a very important industry in the state of Maine, and West Bath was not to be left out. Recall the geology of West Bath, numerous semi-parallel bodies of granite, any one of which would have been conducive to small-scale quarrying. As best as we can figure out, there were two commercials called the Hammett Quarry, or it was operational as of 1873. We believe the current site, or the original site of the Hammett Quarry, is where the West Bath Transfer Station is located now. I have been out here, but have found no evidence for any remnants of the original Hammett Quarry. The Webster Quarry is located at the very, very end of Center Street, just over the town line from Bath into West Bath. It was operational as of 1860. I've gone out there too, and once again, there's not much to see, but if you're interested, go take a look. What did these quarries look like? Did they look like this? The Mount Waldo granite quarry? No way, most definitely not. Did they look like this? The East Blue Hill granite quarry in Hancock County, Maine? Closer, but I still think this is a stretch. My suspicion is that these were pretty small scale operations. However, they played a very, very important role in the building of mid-1800s Bath and West Bath. Why? What did they produce? Well, here's an advertisement from 1873 for the Hammett Quarry. And they produced cellar stones, underpinnings, doorsteps, flagging, curbing, paving, monument bases, foot pieces, and dimension stones of all sizes. This is a time when West Bath was growing by leaps and bounds. The Webster Quarry, in 1909, it provided 255 tons of native granite to build, which is today's Key Bank. So together, these two quarries were providing much of the material that went into the construction, late 1800s construction of Bath, as well as West Bath. But what about before the mid-1800s? All 1700s and early 1800s had granite foundations. And yet there are no commercial quarries of record during this time. So where did the granite come from? Did it come from glacier boulders lying on the ground that were smoothed by hand? Did it come from quarries that have passed out of collective memory? We'll get to this. But before that, we have to understand how quarrying was done in the 1700s and 1800s, and actually is still done. Quarrying was done back then using something called the plug and feather method. The two instruments that were used was a handheld star drill and then two semicircular flanged pieces of iron that are called feathers, and then a wedge-shaped plug between the feathers. Quarrier, with a big hammer, would drill a hole into the rock granite, typically about 4 inches deep or so. The quarrier would drill a series of holes in a straight line. They would then insert the feathers, ledge, pound away. And eventually, the stresses from the plugs on the feathers would force the granite to literally split along a fairly smooth surface. And so the telltale evidence of a quarried granite is the presence of these drill holes on the flat surface. So is there evidence for quarried granite in old West Bath homes? Let's take a look at two of the older homes in West Bath, both of them out on Foster's Point. Stephen Coombs house, which is the oldest existing house in West Bath, built in 1750, and the Ellis Coombs house, AKA the Hamilton house, out by the Hamilton Preserve, the southern end of Foster's Point, which was built around 1773, or at least part of it was. And if one looks in the foundation blocks of granite, one sees in both cases drill holes. This is clear evidence that granite quarry was taking place as early as the 1750s. But where were the quarries? If they existed, they were most likely something called a surface ledge quarry, which is schematically shown here, which is nothing more than exposed outcrop of granite or ledge, which was selectively quarried. Do quarries like this exist in West Bath? During the 1970s and 80s, Dr. Arthur Hussey, a professor of geology at Bowdoin College, was mapping the geology of the West Bath Quadrangle. And in fact, it's his map which provided much of the information in the simplified map, which I've been using throughout this talk. The map was published posthumously only 2 years ago. But in the course of his work, he identified 4 different surface ledge quarries indicated by these quarry symbols. What do they look like? Well, I had the opportunity to visit one of these on the top of Witch Spring Hill, just north of State Road. And the answer is that they don't look like much. On the top of Witch Spring Hill is the remnants of this one surface ledge quarry. And one can see an old quarry pit. You can see granite waste blocks surrounding the pit, the whole thing is overgrown. But every now and then, you can still see exposed ledge with demonstrable drill holes. If you want to visit this quarry, it's accessible via an over-the-hill ATV club trail across the road from the West Bath Fire Station. Go in, bear right at all forks, and eventually you go up the hill and you'll find a quarry. So these 4 quarries could have been the source of granite for all of West Bath, as far back as the 1750s. However, granite is heavy and difficult to transport. The roads were mere paths at this time. It makes more sense that people quarried, if possible, granite outcrops or ledges that were closer to home. They may have even done the quarrying themselves rather than relying upon commercial quarriers or itinerant quarries. Is there evidence for other quarrying locales? Just about a week ago, make that a month ago, I was driving into town on Berry's Mill Road. I live in Sabino, so I make this drive at least once a day, sometimes several times a day. And at the top of Smalls Hill is a fairly significant granite ledge. I've driven by this thing hundreds of times. But for some reason, maybe the sunlight was correct, maybe I happened to look at it at the correct time, but I noticed in the rock right here, telltale quarrying holes. Someone had quarried this rock. Now, there are two 1700s houses nearby. There's the Jonathan Mitchell house, which was built in 1757 and is the second oldest house in West Bath. And the Eldridge Malcolm house, built in around 1790, which unfortunately no longer exists. All that exists is a foundation. Was this ledge the source of granite for the Mitchell and Malcolm houses? Well, I was all excited. And then the cold weather and snow hit it, and I've yet to get back there. So it needs further investigation. But this and other aspects of the quarrying industry have really piqued my curiosity. And as a scientist, I plan on pursuing this further. One final example of geology at work in West Bath, and this is the Davis Mica Mine. It's located on the Wood Farm, which was formerly the Davis Farm, on Berry's Mill Road. The original mine was an open pit, which was located here, which has since been filled with water and expanded into a farm pond. The timing was the early 1940s and World War II. In addition to sending who knows how many young men and women overseas to fight the struggle, West Bath made another small but important contribution to the war effort. And that was the mining of a strategic mineral called muscovite, also known as mica. Why was muscovite an important strategic mineral? We'll get to that. But first, what is muscovite and where does it form? Muscovite is found in pegmatites. It forms books that can be separated into thin but rigid sheets. And these sheets are transparent to light. Pegmatites, recall, they come from granites, formed at very high temperatures, about 600 degrees centigrade. So therefore, the muscovite formed at equally high temperatures. And so it's resistant to high temperature. So these three properties, muscovite forms rigid sheets, it's transparent, and it's heat resistant, make it a valuable commodity. So let's return to the wood farm. This is a geologic map of a small portion of the wood farm. The map was constructed in 1944 and eventually published by Cameron and others in 1954. Once again, the most abundant rock type is layered metamorphic rock. But in this layered metamorphic rock are exposed several pegmatites. One pegmatite, the one which eventually became the Davis Mica Mine, is said to have contained muscovite books that were up to 10 inches in diameter and 8 inches thick. This is bigger than something I've ever seen in my career as a geologist. So this was for real. Open pit mining started in 1942 and ended in 1944, towards the end of the war. The final pit was 80 feet long, 10 to 20 feet wide, and at its steepest, 17 feet deep. And a total of 700 tons of pegmatite, not necessarily muscovite, but pegmatite rock was removed. So why was muscovite so important? The original use, dating back to the 1700s, was as window glass in cast iron stoves. It was rigid, like glass. It was transparent, like glass, but it was heat resistant, unlike glass. Subsequent use, however, has been as spacers within vacuum tubes. Mica layers of rigid mica are placed inside a vacuum tube to provide support for all of the components of a vacuum tube. And when a vacuum tube is turned on, it gets very, very hot. So these spacers have to be heat resistant. This is what made it so important during the Second World War. Electronics were coming of age in all aspects of modern warfare. Whoever had more vacuum tubes had a competitive and strategic edge. It's worth mentioning that Europe really doesn't have much in the way of muscovite. And Germany was so concerned about a lack of muscovite for making vacuum tubes that they enlisted many of their top scientists to try and synthetically make muscovite in the laboratory, much like petroleum engineers were enlisted to make synthetic oil. They actually had some success, but the war ended before it went anywhere. So the Davis mica mine, it was small, short-lived, but played an important role in the war effort. And West Bath should be proud to claim it as part of their history. So in overall conclusion, much of what West Bath is and what it's known for can be directly or indirectly traced back to the underlying geology and geologic history of the region. There are many, many more examples, but not enough time. I hope that you've learned something and enjoyed the presentation. But on a final note, as promised, Smalls Hill. Smalls Hill has apparently been a site for sledding for generations. Smalls Hill Sled Run is actually on top of a ridge, which is composed of granite. And on either side of the granite is softer metamorphic rock. So Smalls Hill is a classic example of differential erosion. So to all parents who take their kids sledding at Smalls Hill, you can now tell them with authority that, kids, you are sledding on granite, but ending up on metamorphic rock. And I'm sure that they will be very impressed. So on that note, I wish to thank you for your time and attention. I wish to make some acknowledgements. First off, Carrie Nelson, an archivist extraordinaire. This presentation simply would not have been possible without her assistance. I want to thank Jack Martin of the Patent Fee Library History Room, who was very helpful in the early days of preparation of this talk. Donna Waterman and Marianne Warner of the Stephen Coombs House and the Hamilton House, who opened up their doors to me, permitted me to walk through the houses, basements, poke my finger in holes in the foundations, etc. Charming women. Chris Stapleton, who took me on a tour of the Witch Spring Hill Granite Quarry, high-powered hunting rifle and all. He said, we might get lucky. The West Bath Historical Society has helped in many ways. And then finally, the Maine Historical Society. And so with that, I will sign off, and I guess I'm open to questions. Thank you.